So the question is, at what point in the development cycle do we realize what stuff is not going to make it in? That really depends a lot on the project, the technology base, and the specific features that we're talking about. The more familiar we are with the technology base, the earlier we can start. Well, it's kind of tricky because in some cases we will not even conceive of certain things, which sounds kind of bad, but if we know the technology to a certain level, we have a certain level of familiarity with it, there are things that we're just not even going to try to do. Like, really, like this engine is, don't try to do that. Because we know it's not a strength of the engine, and it would just be very daunting. So maybe we'll talk about it, but usually it's kind of like, yeah, we're not going to do that, right? Yeah, no, yeah. Okay. Just double check, right? That's really crazy and insane, and we're not going to do that. Other times, we will, it depends on what we're going to do with it. Think a feature that affects how developers need to build things, we want to do early, and we want to test them out early. Because if it's required to build things, and you want to be building the game for a long time, then you better figure it out. Figure out whether it's viable or not, and if so, take steps to actually do it. So, for example, on Fallout New Vegas, we really wanted to have a dialogue editor that was more familiar to us, with a tree-style dialogue system, which actually we don't even. Our internal tools don't use a tree dialogue system anymore. They use a visual flowchart, but a lot of people had worked on Neverwinter 2, which had a collapsing tree system. And so we said, for productivity's sake, we're very familiar with this style of dialogue editor. So we're going to write our own dialogue editor and insert it into the GECK. And we analyzed the risks right away, and there were some risks, but they proved to be not, too crazy. And it didn't take a huge amount of time for us to get the dialogue editor that effectively was the dialogue editor that shipped. And it wasn't as robust as the editor that we had for Neverwinter 2, which we wrote from the ground up, but it did help us a lot when we were writing dialogue. And in terms of productivity, when New Vegas shipped, it had, I don't know who judges these things. I guess the Guinness Book of World Records judges it, but it had the most lines of recorded voice-acted dialogue in a single-player game or something like that. So that was something we knew we had to do right away, and so we tackled it, and we did it right away. Some features we wait on because they might affect gameplay, but the effect on gameplay might not be that large, not really integral, and or if we are confident that it's going to be easy. So if we look at somewhere like, we that's a minor thing, and we can just put that in, and that's fine. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. Well, like certain perks in New Vegas that we added when the gameplay programmers looked at the code. There were certain perks where they're like, well, this is not something that's supported within the editor, but adding it in code and supporting it would be pretty easy, and it's not like a core perk or anything like that. So we're going to do that later. Sometimes later we would figure out that is actually terrible, don't do that. And then there are certain things that kind of fall in the middle. There are certain features where we think they're going to be easy. They're not easy. They're really hard. So, for weird reasons. So a lot of people remember in New Vegas, we put in what are called looping reloads, or maybe you just didn't notice, which is great because it was a huge pain in the butt to put in. So looping reloads are like when you have the lever action rifle and you're like 1, 2, 3, or the shotgun and you're putting in 1, 2, 3. That is a feature that didn't exist in Fallout 3, and we wanted to put it in. I actually was watching some cowboy game that had single action whatever. And it was cool. And I'm like, oh yeah, wow, cool looping reloads. Let's have those. That'll fit the game. And it was easy to put in, relatively easy to put in the looping reloads, where you have a start and then you have a thing that loops for as long as you have rounds or until you interrupt it with the fire button, and then you have an end. animation. And it was relatively easy to put in, and then it kept causing weird problems. And we're like, oh, okay, that's like, yeah, there's a little problem, and then that problem would get fixed, and we're like, okay, it's done. And then a couple weeks later, we're like, oh, there's some other bug with looping reloads and crouching and people popping up and just weird stuff. And it actually turned out to be kind of a problem. It took a long time to fix. And other things like continuous beam. So people have asked like, hey, why don't you have continuous beam lasers in New Vegas? We did at one point, but it turned out they were really hard. And that was something we realized quickly. We thought it was easy, and it was not easy. But we knew very quickly, like, oh, this is causing a lot of problems, and we took it out. So it really depends on the feature. It depends on how it impacts development workflow, and it depends on our level of knowledge with our level of familiarity with the code base. On Icewind Dale 2, we did like nuts stuff in there compared to compared to New Vegas because we had been working with the Infinity engine in some form or another for several years on several titles. So, Rich Finnegan and I, and later Darren and Danian Chi and Bernie Weir and all these other dudes, were like, yeah, man, we're going to make this a 3rd edition game as close as we can. And we knew, like, we're not going to be able to do Tax of Opportunity. We're not going to be able to do meta magic feats. But we're going to refit the entire skill system. Proficiency system is going to become the feat system. And we changed how classes were stored in data, and we recursively. So we just engineered all this stuff, and we felt pretty confident about it. Not everyone felt confident about it, but we felt confident about it, and we did it, and we didn't really encounter too many issues. But that was because we were much more familiar with that code base at that time. So it depends a lot, and usually what we try to do is we partition things early. We try to lay out like what things do we want to do in this. How important are they? Do they impact productivity? What order should we tackle them in? And then we just go from there. And if we plan well, then what we do is if we encounter problems early on, we do a quick analysis like, is this a solvable problem or is this a long-term issue? We cut it, shelve it, refactor it, do whatever. And then we move on. And in an ideal world, in a truly ideal world, like, man, we just did an amazing job and we figured it all out. In the real world, when we do a good job, we cut a minimal amount of stuff, we waste a minimal amount of time, and the features that we put in are very close to what we set out to do.